So thanks everyone for coming. Welcome to the disaster policy planning presentation with Danya Khan. And Danya, I'm gonna go ahead and let you give a little background and introduce yourself.
All right, well, thank you, Christy. And hello and welcome everybody. My name is Danya Khan and I am an assistant professor of practice at Simmons University in Boston, but I live just outside of Saratoga Springs, New York. And I've had a long relationship with New York State libraries. So I worked for many years at Syracuse University and got to know Central New York really well while I was there, and also did a lot of work with the Northern New York Library Network as well. So it is a familiar area to me. And plus being in Saratoga now, it's an easy shot to get up into Northern New York. So I have done a lot of teaching in disaster planning, response, and preparedness. So hopefully this will be a valuable webinar for you and interesting. And it's too bad we can't all be together, but at least we have this opportunity to continue to get the training. So disasters are a matter of when and not if. So if you haven't already experienced a disaster at your institution, you will at some point. So what we're going to do today is to help make those disasters easier to handle, whether it's the smoke detector going off because somebody's popcorn is burning in the microwave, or it's something much, much larger. So many of us know that we have spent years collecting our, building our collections, whether they be library, archival, object, or a big mix of things. So unfortunately, that lifetime of collecting can be destroyed in a matter of hours, whether it's a freak tornado, whether the Ausable fault actually really has a large earthquake, heaven only knows, because I lived in Syracuse, 10 feet of snow wasn't uncommon, but, maybe at some point we'll get 30, who knows? So it, a disaster can be just about anything. For most of us in Northern New York, it probably comes down more to frozen pipes in the winter, because that is not surprising. So what we're going to talk about today is just what a disaster is. And we're going to look at what disaster planning is. We're going to take some time to look at risk assessment. And we're really going to focus today on disaster planning, because the goal is that once we are done today, Christy has shared with you a template for a very simple disaster plan. And the hope is that you can get a good chunk of that filled in before we meet next Monday, because then we can start to talk about how we would actually apply that plan if something were to happen. So a disaster is a sudden, unforeseen, calamitous, or not so calamitous, event that brings about great or not so great damage or loss to property and people, or maybe not, and whose effect will cause an interruption of normal library operations or archive operations or museum operations, depending on what your institution is. And really, when it comes down to it, is it some sort of event that has an impact on your collections, your people, or your building. So again, this could be as simple as somebody in your library reading a book and spilling a cup of coffee on one of the books. That could technically be a disaster, because disasters do not have to be dramatic. It can be that moldy scrapbook. It can be a leak from a pipe. You know, they can be small things, but they can also be very large. And so the beauty of disaster planning is that once you have a disaster plan in place, it becomes very scalable for whatever size disaster you're dealing with. So what is disaster planning? So we have what's called, oh, sorry about that. It's usually an emergency management sort of cycle. And so it's emergency management contains 5 different components. So there's mitigation, there's prevention, there's preparedness, there's response, and then there's recovery. And so what really comes into play is that all of these things need to happen when you have a disaster planning program. And so, or a disaster response program, because you can't do any of these single items in a vacuum. So, you know, we think about disaster planning. And so we are going to talk about risk assessment, which is going to help us take a look at mitigation and prevention. So when we do risk assessment, we're going to be looking at areas of risk in our institution, and we're going to be thinking about how to mitigate those risks so that they don't exist anymore, or if they do occur, their impact will be minimized. Preparedness is taking that risk assessment to the next level and really building yourself a toolkit so that when something happens, you can respond more quickly and recovery happens more quickly and more efficiently, and thus costs less money. So all of these steps really are happening all the time, or should be happening all the time. And there's something in it that really helps you to take a look at your institution and your collections in a very different way than you probably have in the past. So let's take a little bit of time to talk about risk assessment. So risk assessment consists of an objective evaluation of risk. And objective is a very important word here. You need to take a look at your institution, your building, your grounds with entirely new eyes. That, you know, closet that's always looked like, you know, the next time you open the door to try to put something in it, it's just going to explode out at you. You actually need to look at that with fresh eyes and say, what is in here and why do we have this and what can we do about it? Because there's going to be a lot of things like that at our institutions, but we need to be very honest and open with ourselves about this. So taking evaluation of risk in which hazards to collections and uncertainties about things are very clearly considered and presented. Part of the difficulty in a risk assessment is that it's a measurement of both the quantities in which risk assessment is concerned. So what is the potential impact or loss that could occur? And then what is the probability of it occurring? And I can honestly admit, when I first moved to New York in 1999, I would have sworn upside down and backwards that New York was nowhere near California. It was not, there were no earthquake risks in New York. Well, I was wrong. So, you know, how likely is there to be an earthquake in northern New York? Well, more frequently than I ever thought actually possible. Are they large earthquakes? No. But they do occur. So, you know, what is the probability of that happening? Not as high as, you know, say an ice storm in January when, it goes, we have a January thaw and then it gets very cold and you lose your power. That's probably more common than the earthquake, but it's knowing your institution, knowing your neighborhood to be able to make some of these practical evaluations in terms of potential and probability. And it's not easy, but it is very important to do a risk assessment. And even though we're not doing it as part of this webinar series, it is an important step to take at some point. So we want to be thinking about those areas where we have a high probability of them occurring and where they have a high probability of having an impact on our building and our collections. And then those are the sorts of things we're going to think about mitigating. But before we get to that, why do we want to perform a risk assessment? And it's not just because I say so. First off, it helps you to determine your vulnerabilities so that you can be more aware of them and actually take steps to mitigate that impact. A risk assessment is also really helpful in helping to maximize your time and your resources. And to be perfectly honest, when I've done programs in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, and in Rhode Island, I have worked with people to do full-blown risk assessments as part of their disaster planning process. And I would ask questions that they didn't know the answer to. We would find problems with the building that they didn't know existed because they don't go to the basement. So why would they know? And these are all, in many ways, simple things that really take a lot of the burden off of, future disasters. Because if you can find problems when they're small, they're easier to fix, they're less costly to fix. And it really helps to, tick the box of, okay, we've dealt with that. We don't have to worry about it for now, but we're going to keep checking on it. So how do we perform a risk assessment? You need to identify the hazards. You need to assess the risks. You need to implement appropriate measures, and you need to always be monitoring and reassessing these risks. This is a great thing to do with your facilities person if you have one. If you're part of a municipal system, it's great to bring in somebody from your town to, whoever is in charge of your building from the town, great to walk through them. And, with them, because they're the ones that have the history, but they're also the ones that are going to be dealing with it, or, your facilities person on your board, your facilities person at your larger institution, if you're with an academic institution. It's really important that you get somebody on who knows the building better than you in many ways. So what are we going to be looking at? So the first thing that we want to look at is our setting. Where are you? Are you deep in the high peaks of the Adirondacks, or are you like one of our participants and just down here in Greenwich, which isn't all that far from me, and which I go to quite a lot, by the way, because I have bees. And so, where are you? What are the natural hazards most common to your specific location and your community? Risk assessment is very personal. So, where are you? Are you more urban or are you more rural? And that's going to have a big impact on the services that are available to you and how quickly they can get there. Is your fire department professionally staffed, or is it a volunteer fire department? So do you have to call people in before they can come out to fight a fire? Again, rural, especially if you're in the Adirondacks or near the Adirondacks, you've got a lot of wildlife that you need to be thinking about. And, wildlife coming into your building for the winter can cause a lot of damage. So, where are you? You know, again, are you on the top of a hill? Are you at the bottom of the hill? Are you on a river? These are very important things to be taking note of. Are you in your own building? Or do you share a building with somebody else? And if you do, who else is in there? If you own your own building, who are your neighbors? Do you know your neighbors? Do you know what they do? And it may seem like a strange thing, but if you've got a neighbor who's, you know, say a hardware store, and they have a lot of paint and something happens and they have a fire and that paint starts to burn, you're going to have a lot of problems in your building. So you really need to understand what they have, but also what their hours of operation are. So if they're open after you're closed, is that going to pose a problem or not? And you know, what sort of clientele do they draw? What is your infrastructure? And here I'm not talking about your building, but the greater infrastructure around you. Is, you know, are your roads in good repair, or are there a lot of potholes? Is there a lot of traffic? How do your, you know, does the drainage work well, or in heavy rains, does it regularly flood your parking lot? You know, what, you know, and this I know is going to sound really silly, but do you know the age of your utility infrastructure? So if you are on, say, city water, how old are those water mains? You know, they have been known to blow. So, you know, have there been past problems with infrastructure in your community? You know, and then keeping on that whole theme of water, if you aren't on city water and you're on a well, do you have a pump for backup, or do you have a backup power supply for your pump? And, you know, then keeping with water, how far are you from the nearest fire hydrant? And does your local fire department know that they would need to bring a water truck with them if they were coming to your site if you don't have a hydrant? You know, and then, you know, also the infrastructure of your building. Do you have gutters? How does it drain away? You know, when the snow melts, does it drain away as well, or does it all come straight into your basement? If you've got a dry well that your gutters drain into, how old is it? Is it clogged up through years and years of leaves getting in there and not actually functioning as it should? You know, and keeping your water is a big thing here. Does your landscaping slope away from your building, or does it actually slope towards? And what's your soil like? Is it quick draining soil, or is it heavy, heavy clay? I've got heavy clay, but I know when I go up to Great Camp Sagamore in Racket Lake, it's sandy soil and it drains really quickly. So, you know, even down to things like, what is your dirt like? All can have a big impact on how you assess risks at your institution. And then finally, you know, take some time to talk to your local police department, find out what sorts of crime statistics there are, and, you know, what the rate of crime is, because none of us are immune to that. So we also want to identify the hazards confronting us, of course, from Mother Nature. But we also have industrial hazards that could be problems. We could have human problems. We could have technological problems. So, you know, natural hazards, again, are very localized. You know, you can be within 5 miles of another institution and have entirely different natural hazard risks to deal with. And I know that sounds strange, but it's actually amazing, especially if you're somebody that's grown up or experienced tornadoes a lot. There's always those areas that the tornado just doesn't go. And then there are always places that just seem to be tornado magnets. And the same goes for flooding. You know, 5 miles is a huge distance when it comes to flooding. You know, are you in an area that you do need to be concerned about wildfires? I don't know about northern New York, but I know here where we are, it has been a very, very dry summer. And I got very nervous with everybody setting off fireworks because I still have some chunky or crispy grass in my yard. And I know that the moisture level does not go down more than an inch in my garden. So, you know, are you in an area that would be prone to wildfires? And of course, we know how close are you to the Ausable Fault? You know, so are you going to have to worry about, you know, an earthquake, which again, like I said, still is amazing to me that we have to worry about earthquakes in New York. But we also have industrial and environmental hazards. So you get the ice storm, your power goes out, and, you know, do you have heat still? You know, so if you have radiators and say, well, we don't, you know, need to worry about electricity, we've got radiators, well, you still need a pump to keep the water flowing through your radiators. You know, any sort of thing, most of our facilities require electricity. So almost regardless of your heating system, unless you heat only by wood fire, or, you know, even if you have a pellet stove, that requires electricity to be feeding in the pellets. You know, if your heat is gas, it still needs to be circulated in your building. If it's oil, it still needs to be circulated in your building. So, you know, a power failure, which is probably fairly common, is a big problem. I know even here close to Saratoga, where I am, we lose power at least 3 or 4 times a year. Usually it's somebody runs into a power line or something, but it does happen. So what if you have a sewer backup, whether you're on city sewer or if you've got a septic system? You know, you could have a sewage backup, and I really hope none of you ever have to experience that, but it does happen. And then, you know, sometimes people look at me funny when I say it, but, you know, you need to think about transportation around your area. You know, do you have a rail line that goes near your institution? What would happen if the train derailed? What if there was an aircraft accident? And I know I think about that all the time. I'm in the flight path for the Schenectady Air Force Reserve Base, and they're flying low all the time. And I just, you know, dread the thought of them coming down anywhere near here. You know, so again, what is very personal to you? And then finally, you know, we've got human hazards, or not finally, sorry. You know, I try not to be too pessimistic about human nature, but there are people out there who will vandalize, who will steal, who will set light to things, and who will call in bomb threats. And, you know, unfortunately, we all have to worry about active shooter incidents now. So there's a wide range of human incidents that we have to take into account, and that's where talking to your police department is so important. And then finally, don't forget to think about your digital assets. So, you know, you have to be thinking about hacking or cyber terrorism. What happens if your server crashes? What happens if your network crashes? And, you know, if you've been digitizing and saving everything on CD or DVD, you need to be thinking about what you're going to do to convert all of that, because CDs and DVDs are actually on their way out. They're on the way towards obsolescence. So what are you going to do to ensure you don't lose all of that work and time and money you've put into creating these digital collections? So we don't talk a lot about digital disaster planning specifically, but always keep it in the back of your mind. And it's a very important part of what we do now. So we also want to, of course, take a look at our building, because that is the biggest box that our collections are in. So I tend to essentially take a couple of approaches. You look inside and outside, attic to basement, roof to foundation. And so, you know, again, very, very personal. what construction materials went into building your building? When was it built? When was the last time your wiring was updated? When was the last time your plumbing was updated? You know, are these elements going to have an influence on the hazards that surround you? So, you know, I'll take Great Camp Sagamore for an example again. It's all wood frame construction at Sagamore. Either, you know, cedar, you know, bark covered logs or cedar shakes. And if a fire ever started at or near Sagamore, those buildings would go up in a heartbeat because they're, you know, over 100 years old. The wood is very dry, and, you know, it's something that, you know, you just really have to think about. So you also want to think about, though, how your building is actually laid out and how it's furnished. Does the layout and furnishing actually contribute to the risk that your building would face, particularly for fire? And if you haven't read it, I really recommend reading the library books by Susan Orlean, because that really, in the first couple of chapters, lays out in detail the Los Angeles Public Library fire from the 1980s. And it's the perfect example of how your building construction, how your building is laid out, can have a huge impact on fire. So don't be afraid to talk to your local fire chief or your local fire marshal to have them come and do a walkthrough of your building. They can be a valuable asset in helping you figure out what you need to do to make your building safer. You know, if you talk to them about this being for, you know, disaster planning purposes, and you want to improve your facilities, they're not going to come in and shut you down in the blink of an eye. They want to make sure you're safe and your patrons are safe. And so they're going to work with you, not against you. You know, so they're going to want to know, do you have a fire detection system? And if you do, is it connected to anything? Or is it like the tree in the forest? If nobody's there to hear it, is it making a noise? Do you have a fire suppression system? So do you have a sprinkler system? What kind of sprinkler system is it? How old is it? And are you making sure those pipes are protected if the power goes out? You know, so many questions. You also want to think about your building maintenance. How frequently is it maintained inside and out? Is it in good shape? If you do a lot of deferred maintenance, if your building is in poor condition, you're going to be more prone to disasters. You're going to get the pests coming in because it's easy to come in. You're going to have electrical problems. You're going to have plumbing problems. So make sure that you're thinking about maintenance. And along with maintenance, do you know what chemicals are being stored on site? So do you have a janitor's closet? Do you know what's stored in there in terms of cleaning materials? Is that something you're going to have to worry about? Do you store the lawnmower for your grounds with its can of gas adjacent to your gas furnace that has a pilot light? You know, that has actually happened to me, and it was in New York. So not up in northern New York, though. It was in central New York, but it was a little bit unsettling to walk into their boiler room and see the lawnmower, the gas can, and the live flame all very close to each other. So, you know, but then again, even something as simple as, does your janitor have both bleach and ammonia? If the earthquake hits and those fall off the shelves, are they going to mix? Is it going to be bad? And then, of course, going back to, you know, our building, is it of an age where it has asbestos? If it has lead, you know, are there PCBs in and around your building? You know, where was your building built? What was there before? You know, if it's a newer building. And then outside, you know, check your roof, check your gutters, check your foundation, check your windows, check your siding, and always look at your landscaping. You know, how is it landscaped? Do you have a lot of shrubs around the foundation of your building, trapping in moisture or allowing people to hide? Do you have sufficient lighting so that people are safe after dark? And again, are you maintaining your building from the outside as well as from the inside? And that was a lot of information that I've just thrown at you. And the beauty is that you don't have to come up with all of this on your own. The Heritage Preservation, which is now part of the American Institute for Conservation, has a program on assessing risks. And as part of that program, they have a form. And so you can go to this link and you can go to that form and you can download the form, and it will walk you through so many of the risks that you need to be looking out for, that then you can focus on what is unique to you and your institution and your location. So it's the program is called the Risk Evaluation and Planning Program. And I can't recommend it enough to help you through your risk assessment. So take a look at that. And like I said, it's not necessarily part of this program, but take some time to do a risk assessment at some point, because it is very important down the line for disasters. So once we've done that risk assessment, we're not done yet. We need to consider how we're going to mitigate the risks that we've identified for both the building and the setting, and start to figure out how we can reduce that risk or completely eliminate that risk. There's very little chance that you can eliminate all of your risks, but there will be some that you can. So for example, if you have regular leaks in your roof, replacing your roof will eliminate that risk. Now, is that financially feasible at the moment? No, but maybe this is something you do a capital campaign for, or you work to get money from the community to get a new roof. So you want to really take a look at those risks, figure out how you're going to mitigate them, and then make a list. And you're going to start tackling those mitigation issues that will be the most effective, or those that are most related to your highest risks, your most likely probability risks. And one of the nice things is that also included in that risk evaluation and planning program is a spreadsheet that you can print out that has you say what the likelihood of the risk occurring, how big of an impact it's going to have, and then you multiply those numbers and you can start to see as you go down the list where you see really high numbers. Those are your highest risks with the most impact, and those are probably the ones you should work on mitigating first. So, it can be as, just simple as setting up a regular maintenance program, or even setting up schedules for regular inspection of problem areas. It can be something as simple as getting staff on board to unplug any small appliances at the end of the day. So the coffee makers, the microwave, the tea kettles, anything like that, so that you don't run the risk of fire happening in your old building with old wiring when nobody's there. It's inspecting supply closets and storage closets for chemicals or a lot of paper goods blocking your electrical panel. Things, making sure doors and windows are all locked at night. Down to one of my favorite actual mitigation practices, but also a very important factor for disaster planning, which is labeling all of your shutoff valves in your building very clearly and very largely with like fluorescent yellow tags, along with an arrow or an image to show you what is on and what is off. Because if everybody knows where the shutoff valve is, when that toilet overflows or when that pipe bursts, everybody knows where they can go to shut it off, and you don't waste time waiting for your plumber to show up, because time is of the essence for a lot of what we're going to be planning for. So all of this comes down to the fact that, yes, disasters are rare, and this is a lot of work we're putting in, but emergencies are common. And the distinction here being, an emergency is something that's occurring that needs to be dealt with in the moment and quickly. Any emergency can become a disaster if you don't act. So your disaster plan really, in many ways, is going to be a way to prevent a disaster from occurring. So, you know, all of these, you know, emergencies, a leaky pipe, a mouse infestation, the bear getting into the garbage cans, you know, all of these little things are really important to take care of right away, because they can build and they can be a problem. So in this picture that we see, this is an institution in Rhode Island that I worked with, and they had a skylight in their historic building, and it had been leaking for years, and nobody did anything about it. It was a skylight. It leaks. It's always leaked. It's leaked for the last 20 years that I've been here, and nothing has happened, so I'm not going to worry about it until one day when the ceiling collapses. And that does not look like a very big area of plaster that fell, but it's actually huge. And it damaged collections, and the library was open at the time that that fell, and it could have been so much worse. But as a result, they had somebody come in and check, and because those leaks had never been dealt with, practically the entire ceiling in that room needed to be redone, or it would all come falling down. And so, you know, a little emergency like a leak can seem like nothing, but if you don't respond, it can become something much, much worse. So we need to ask ourselves, are we ready for anything? And if you're not, then that's where the disaster plan comes in. So a disaster plan takes time to write. So, you know, what's it going to let us do that we don't already know? Well, it's going to help improve your reaction time. You're going to know exactly who to call and when. And as we know, time is money. So again, like with the, you know, shutoff valves, if you know where that water shutoff valve is, you can go shut it off and prevent your entire basement from flooding, or your entire first floor from flooding, or, you know, having a, you know, cascading waterfall coming down your stairs when the toilet overflows and nobody knows how to shut it off. It's going to help you focus on solutions for major problems during and after the event, rather than the minutia. So a disaster plan really helps you focus on the big picture when most of us are incredibly stressed and can only seem to manage the minutia. So it really helps you see the forest for the trees. It's going to help you know what needs to be saved or salvaged, rather than deciding that in the heat of the moment. So, you know, do you know what your priority collections are, or can they all be replaced easily? And that's really going to depend on the type of institution that you are and what collections you have. And we'll get into that a little bit more in just a few slides. Having a disaster plan does decrease the emotional and stressful impact of those involved, because if you don't have something to focus on, you're focused on the disaster. You can only see the disaster, and it just keeps preying at your mind and getting worse and worse and worse. But if you have that piece of paper in front of you, you are now focusing on that piece of paper, which is telling you what to do and who to call, and it helps reduce that stress. You aren't as emotional if you can just focus on something other than what's going on in front of you. So, you know, it's really, strangely enough, a really good tool for that. And it lets you have information readily available at your fingertips about who's responsible for what, who do you call, what are the resources we have, how do we do something, and what's the procedure. So again, it takes a lot of that decision-making off of your shoulders during a very stressful time. And so you can just essentially follow the bouncing ball and just do what the paper says, and it will help you get started in your response process so that it is less stressful. From an entirely different perspective, why? Because there is value in our cultural heritage. And, you know, here we can, I mean, this is so true now in that, you know, our cultural heritage identifies us. And especially for, you know, small communities, that sense of community history is crucial to who you are and what you do. And if you lose that history, if you lose that stuff, it has a real impact on your community. So don't underestimate how important your, you know, local history collection is, how important all of those vital records are at your town hall. And really don't forget how much cultural heritage contributes every year to your local tourism and your tourist dollars. It's huge. So being able to make sure that you can get back up and running as soon as you can is very important. So, you know, don't be the one institution that can't reopen because of a, you know, disaster. I mean, right now, all of us are closed and we're all struggling with the same problem. But you don't want to be the one institution, the only institution that has the problem. That's a lot harder to recover from. So, you know, don't lose that tangible evidence of your community's unique heritage. Because we know so much of what we have in our libraries, in our archives, in our museums, especially our small local ones, a lot of that is irreplaceable. You know, there isn't going to be somebody else who has all of this, you know, large collection of letters, you know, that really talk about a moment in time, or all of those photographs of, you know, historic town events that really speak to people and really tell your story. Don't let that be you, you know, don't lose that, because it's really going to be hard, not only on your institution, but also on your institution, your community. Don't know where my brain is. So what is the process that we want to take in terms of disaster planning? Disaster planning should be a group effort and should not be done in a vacuum. Even if you are the only person who works at the institution, this is where you still work with your local fire department, work with your local police department to get the information that you need to be able to do this well. So by getting other people working with you, you're also getting buy-in. So by working with your fire department, working with your police department, they start to get to know who you are as an institution and why you are important to the community. And so they have a better understanding of why they should really do everything they can to help you. It's building relationships. So whether you're a single person or you have multiple staff, you want to start by selecting people to help write this plan that have responsibility for your collections, for safety, for administration, and for your facilities. And a lot of times people wear multiple hats, but you want to make sure that you are getting the people in the institution who have the knowledge and who have the responsibility to be part of this, because you are going to need their information. And again, stakeholders from outside are going to be very helpful. Again, especially if you are part of a municipal entity, so you're a municipal public library, you need to involve whoever from the town is going to be a part, who you are a part of. So even if it's just to let them know you're doing this and why you're doing it, they still need to have some knowledge. So having this committee is really important, because you do need to make some hard decisions. And one of the biggest is going to be assessing your collections in terms of priorities for salvage. And that really shouldn't be done by just one person. You really want different people to have a say in this. And don't just let them say, this is an important collection, you must save it. The question becomes why. And so if you gather all of that information, not only do you have a much better understanding of your collections, but you do have some framework then to develop your priorities. So when you start the planning process, of course, you're going to review that risk assessment. And again, why it's important to have people from different areas. You're going to be looking at the services you offer and, how people use the institution, when they use the institution, and what volume you have, how many people are coming and going throughout the day, and use that risk assessment as a basis for a lot of this. And as with anything, especially as so many of us have been working from home, we know we need to set goals and set a timetable for getting this done so that it doesn't fall by the wayside and get started and then never finished. This is something you need to finish. And that's why we're going to be working from the pocket response plan that you've been sent. So the reason I sent you the pocket response plan is it's really easy to write a very comprehensive, very wordy, very unwieldy and unuseful disaster plan. So a good disaster plan is very clear and concise and well organized. It's relevant to you and your institution and not anybody else. It's really a product of staff involvement from across the staff. It's going to be widely distributed. And again, this is the beauty of the pocket response plan. You're going to have some semblance of staff training in there, and we'll get to that next week. And it should always be reviewed and updated annually, because as we know, things change. So if one of your risks was, you've got a very leaky roof, and 3 years after you write your plan, the roof is fixed, well, now you need to reassess your risks, and does that have an impact on your disaster plan? So it's a living, breathing document and shouldn't just be printed out, stuck in a folder, and forgotten about. So I've alluded to some of the people that you really need involved in disaster planning. So let's talk about that a little bit more. So you really want to make sure you have administrative support for your disaster planning, because when it comes right down to it, if you have a disaster, it's going to involve money. And as we know, most of the money runs through administration. You need somebody who really understands the collections, and not just what you have, but how it's used. You know, what areas of your collections get the most use, what gets the fewest, you know, what's in really good condition, what's irreplaceable. And then you definitely need somebody who really knows the facilities. And those three at an absolute minimum should be who's involved. If you have an active board, the board will probably be involved in some way, whether you want them to or not. You know, if you're a municipal library, again, get your municipality involved. If you are more of like a living history museum, so for example, again, Great Camp Sagamore, the caretaker would definitely be involved because he is there and lives on site and would know a lot of information that isn't necessarily widely known for those who don't stay overnight on site. Involve your local first responders. They are invaluable and they really can become strong partners. Sometimes you need to involve local vendors. So, you know, if you have a lot of digital collections, you want to make sure you speak to your, you know, whoever provides your server or does your IT work, because they're going to know your system, especially if you don't. And you're just going to, you know, if you have a lot of problems with leaks, you'll really want to, you know, maybe talk to your local carpenter and get to know them. It's all about building relationships so that when you need someone, they will be there. You also want to think about talking ahead of time to disaster recovery vendors, because they're the ones that are going to be able to come in after a really big disaster and help you out with a lot of the heavy lifting. So if you have collections that can't be just thrown away and replaced, but you have to somehow salvage them, you want to involve the disaster recovery vendors. And there are three that do really good work. One is Polygon, and they are based out of New Hampshire, but have offices, I know they have offices in Albany. Belfour, which also has offices in Albany, and Blackman Mormon's Thematic Catastrophe, and I can't remember where their office is. It might only be New York, but I know Polygon and Belfour both have offices right in and around Albany. And so, you know, this is somebody that would be able to help fast, and they know cultural heritage collections, and they're not going to do anything to damage your collections, unlike a service master or a serve pro who don't actually know, even though they'll tell you they do document recovery, they don't have the experience that Polygon and Belfour definitely have. So I have not personally worked with BMSCAT, but I have with both Belfour and Polygon, and they are consummate professionals. So, you know, it is something to think about. And then if you have really important materials, you know, you do want to think about working with a conservator ahead of time. And so for any of you who have sent something to either the, you know, New York State Library's discretionary grant program for conservation, or through the Greater Hudson Heritage Network's conservation treatment grant program, you know, you already probably have some connection with a conservator, but if you don't, you want to think about it. Your plan needs to be in writing, and I like to support it with images, so that, you know, again, like with the shut-off valves, you don't have to think there's a picture right there. It's a living document and should not be just put in a drawer. And most importantly, and this is where I've had a lot of, excuse me, discussions with people, it needs to be printed out. It's okay if you have a digital copy, that's fine, but it has to be printed out, because what do you do if the power is out in your building? You have no electricity, so you can't boot up the computer. You have no internet. And I've been to enough places in and around northern New York where there are dead zones, so even your cell phone's not going to be a help all the time. So, you know, make sure you have a printed copy. And again, we'll talk about the benefit of the Pocket Response Plan. The clue is in the name in just a little bit. So one of the biggest things with disaster planning is that you need to ask a lot of questions. And sometimes they're questions that you don't know the answer to and you have to go find, or they're going to be questions that bring up issues that need to be resolved that have just always been ignored throughout the years. So, so some questions to find out, especially from your facilities person, is, are facilities and systems information written down somewhere in one location? So is there a log of, what type of furnace do you have? Who installed it? When was it installed? Questions like that. Is this information in one place so that if you needed to access it and your facilities person was on vacation in Tahiti, you can do something? Even if it's calling somebody else, you can at least tell them, here is what we have, and they will know what to bring. So who would you need to contact in the event of a larger incident? It's not so much the smoke detector is going off because somebody burnt their toast in the toaster. It's, if you come into work and you find out that a pipe is burst and the basement is flooding, do you know who to call? Or would you have to call somebody else to find out who to call? All of these extra steps add time to the process and make it more costly to recover from. So if you know that if your basement is flooded, here is who you call, that saves a lot of time and thus a lot of money. Do you have insurance? Do you know what that insurance covers? You can have, if you arrive at your institution and your basement is flooded, is it really a flood? Because if it is, you've had a really incredibly snowy winter and a wet spring, and your basement is flooded because the groundwater has seeped up from below, most insurance companies do not include that in flood insurance. So you need to know what your insurance actually covers. And if you're unsure of the terminology, talk to your insurance agent, because you don't want to find out that you're going through all of this work and you're going to have to find your own money somewhere because it's not actually something that's covered by insurance. Do you have existing vendor contracts in place? So, beyond a disaster recovery vendor, this could be plumbers and electricians and carpenters, locksmiths. As somebody who has frequently locked themselves out of practically everywhere they've lived, I love locksmiths. So think about the range of things you may need at your institution. And this again includes your internet service provider, your website designer, whoever, your website host, all of that information. You need to think about, if your building is flooded and you can't actually be in your building to do the response and the recovery work, then where are you going to coordinate from? Could you work with your local school to have an office or a room there? Is there somewhere in town hall that would let you have a room? Ideally, these would be places with connections to the internet, with telephone, with, heat and hot water, especially for those winter-based disasters. Heat's always a good thing. And don't forget, one of the most important things is access to coffee and sugary snacks. Never underestimate coffee and sugary snacks when you're responding to a disaster. And then if it is something larger, then how are you going to manage site security? So if a flood has come through and damaged your building so that you can't lock your building up, how are you going to manage site security? Because you don't want vandalism or theft or a lot of angry raccoons in addition to your disaster. So in the grand scheme of things, and this is the big picture of disaster planning, what do you really want to be thinking about? You want to have some sort of emergency information sheet. Who do you call and when? You want to have some sort of institutional communication plan. So a staff contact list. And again, who gets called when? So if you have your fire alarm connected to somebody, if you have security alarms connected to a third party that's monitoring them, you need to provide them with the list of who to call when those alarms go off. And most of the time they want a list of 5 people. So they start with the person who is number 1 on the list, and whoever is number 1, you want to make sure has the authority and the knowledge and the keys to get into the building. And then, and is close. So if your director lives 45 minutes away, but your head of circulation lives 5 minutes away, you probably want your head of circulation as number 1. And then as they go down the list, if number 1 doesn't answer, they call number 2. Number 2 doesn't answer, they call number 3. So you really want to think about that sort of communication plan list as well, both for outside vendors and for within your staff. So, if you're just the library assistant and you show up and the basement is flooded, you need to know who to call. And that may be, call the plumber first and then call the library director. So you need to be thinking about different ways and who to contact. And it can get very confusing and convoluted. And this is where staff training will come in. If you are a large enough institution, you want to actually think about having disaster response team members. In most places that I have worked, those people who are involved in writing the plan become the members of the disaster response team, because A, they know the plan, and B, they are those people who know the money, they know the insurance, they know the collections, they know the building. So, we will talk about this a little bit more next week. We want to think about collection salvage priorities, and we're going to get to that in just a bit. We want to make sure that we have a note as to where we have existing disaster recovery supplies and where they are. As part of your disaster planning process, you're going to want to think about where you have put these. We're going to talk more about this next Monday. And then appendices are great. I tend to use appendices for floor plans, but you can use appendices for just about anything you want. But this is where all of the step-by-step, maybe technical information goes that you don't want cluttering up the actual plan, which really is for that immediate first, few hours of a response. So collection salvage priorities. These are often the most skipped section of a disaster plan because it's often very difficult to come to consensus on what constitutes your priority collections. But it is incredibly important to list them out, especially if time is limited as well as budgets. So if you think about it, you have a flood at the beginning of August. You don't have a lot of time before the mold starts to set in. So you want to make sure you're getting your priority collections into the freezer first rather than your non-priority collections. So these are not, I repeat, not collections that are going to be grabbed as you run out of the burning building, but those things that you will take care of first when you can get back into your building. It can't be said enough, but human safety is always the first priority. In disaster planning, in risk assessment, in disaster response, human safety is always going to be number one. And so when you're doing your risk assessment, when you're doing your planning, keep that at the forefront of your mind. So when we are talking about salvage priorities, you want to first ask yourself, what are the most important collections? Not individual items, but your most important collections. Usually, I mean, this differs again from institution to institution, so it's a very personal list. So you want to think about any vital institutional information. So, you know, if you have a state charter, or you have your articles of incorporation, or your personnel records, trust me, people will want to get paid. All of that sort of vital, functional institution information needs to be saved. It's often overlooked, but it's actually one of the most important things that you need. Included in this for, you know, is your catalog. So, you know, most of us now have online catalogs. Is your catalog backed up somewhere? And have you checked on that backup? If you do a lot of exhibits and you have borrowed things, especially if you're doing an exhibit and you have borrowed things from your local community, from individuals in your local community, those items that you have borrowed are practically top of the list because you accepted responsibility for them. You can't ignore them because it will become a PR nightmare. You want to think about those collections that directly support your mission. If you don't have a mission, you might want to think about looking at that because it really does drive everything that you do and helps you make these sorts of decisions. You know, so if you're a public library, then, you know, look at, you know, what supports your mission is, you know, most of it is providing information to the public. So when you look at your statistics every year, what segments of your collections get the most use? For a lot of us, it's our children's books. But beyond that, excuse me, what other collections get a lot of use? And if they're very expensive to replace, those may become your priority collections. You know, so for example, you have a local history collection with a lot of the, you know, you think of the Victorian histories of the region versus your adult romance fiction. Local history is going to take precedence over Danielle Steele or 50 Shades of Grey any day. So you really want to think in terms not only of what gets a lot of use, but also what is most expensive to replace. And the Library of Congress has generally kept a rough guide to replacement values for, I believe it's really just in the Library of Congress classification system, but it could be in Dewey as well, but by classification, so by call number. And it's a really handy thing to take a look at. It's a little out of date now, but it gives you a good idea in terms of cost, but you also probably get that from your own purchasing agreements. And then finally, you know, think about some of those items that might be difficult to recover if they're left for too long. So if you have plaster casts around, or you have quilts that the library owns, or paintings, those would be things you want to think about making priorities. But again, it's going to be based on your collection. So if it's replaceable and it's easily replaced, then it doesn't become a priority, unless you have specific provenance issues. Excuse me. So, for example, you know, if you have some of the items that Teddy Roosevelt had with him when he was in the Adirondacks, when he was whisked away to become president, they may not seem all that unique and interesting if you just look at them as an object. But the provenance and the story behind that object is really what makes it important and makes it a priority. So, and again, don't forget about your digital assets. So if you've been digitizing collections and you have them up on your website and they're only backed up on CDs or DVDs, where are those stored? And if you had a disaster in your institution, would you lose both your computers and your backups? So, you know, think about your digital assets as well when you are looking at priority collections. So you also don't just want to have a list. You want to have some way to locate these collections within the building. So it really helps to create a map of where these priority collections are. Now, you can be very detailed and very clear about your map. You know, if you have the actual architectural drawings and the layouts of your building, and you've got somebody who knows how to do it, they can overlay all of these great colors, which, believe me, if you've had an earthquake or a flood, things move, so it's good to have some idea of where they were to start with so you know where they might end up. Or it can be incredibly simple. For those of us who are not good digital artists, and well, for those of us who are not artists by any stretch of the imagination, your maps can be as simple or as complex as you want. But you want to make sure that things are really clear. So here you can see, you know, the things that are colored in red, those are the most important things. You've got your directional, so you know what's north, so you know your orientation. And, you know, one would hope that, you know, they thought about moving the file server because having it right next to a bathroom, which would flood, which would short out the electricity, was maybe not a good idea. But, you know where your priorities are. Or if you're really not an artist, you can take digital pictures and do like the person did here. The things circled in red, these are what we want. X'd out, we don't need to worry about those. So no matter what you do, just make sure things are very clear. Another thing that you can do, especially if you have boxes of things, is get reflective tape. Because if you put a little piece, it doesn't have to be big, just a little piece of reflective tape on every box that's a priority. When you come through, when the power is out and all you have is a flashlight, those boxes are going to leap out at you. They're going to be like fireflies on a summer night. They're just going to tell you, I am here, come get me. So I want to move on now and talk about the pocket response plan that you're all going to be working on for next Monday. It was developed by the Council of State Archivists, and they have been very kind in allowing me to modify this plan for, I don't know how many times I've modified it now, but I believe there are at least 4 or 5 states now that I have created pocket response plans specifically for. So the one we're going to be working on is specifically for Northern New York. And so the beauty of it is, and I'm going to pop back and forth here a little bit, but it prints out as an 11 by 14 sheet of paper, or an 8.5 by 14 sheet of paper. On one side, you have all of your communication plan, everybody who needs to be called and what their contacts are. And on the back side is all sorts of other information, which we will get to in a bit. But it is one sheet of paper, printed double-sided. And if you look at the columns, what happens is that when you fold this up, you get something the size of a credit card, so that it just fits into your wallet. It is always with you. You never have to wonder where it is. And even if the power's out, you can read it. So you can see we start with our institutional contacts. So, you know, who at your institution needs to be involved. So, you know, your director, and, you know, again, here, there's going to be a lot of people listed that maybe don't apply to you, but the beauty is this is a Word document. So if it doesn't apply to you, take it out. Don't let it clutter up your plan. But it is, like many of the templates, it's going to give you the sort of, don't forget these people in your contacts. So, you know, there's going to be a lot of people involved. And so it gives you the opportunity to list those people specific to your institution. It also asks you to think about who's on your disaster team. So again, we were talking about who gets called, you know, for the alarms and whatnot, who gets called first, second, third, fourth. Most likely these people are going to be on that list. It's also going to get you to think about who to contact for your building utilities. You know, who is your potable water? Who does your fire sprinklers if you have them? You know, who's your plumber? Do you have a plumber, or does your own facilities person take care of that? Or when they can't deal with something, you know, who would you call? So again, if your facilities person is in Tahiti, you need to know who to call, who your plumber is, you know. And again, your electrician, who supplies your gas if you're if you've got gas, who supplies your oil if you have oil. You know, now, you know, who actually supplies your telephone service. If you have elevators, who services them, if you have a security system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So these are, you know, there to get you thinking. And then, of course, your first responders, as always, if it's an emergency, just call 911. Everybody will come, but that's okay. You will, you know, a lot of you will have individual numbers for your fire department, your EMS, your police. For those of you in larger communities, you probably have a town emergency manager, and they're a good person to connect with because they're concerned with the emergency management for your entire town. And they may not realize what an important feature of the town you are. So you know, if you don't have a relationship with your town emergency manager, you definitely want to do that. If you're in a smaller community, that person is generally the fire chief or the police chief. Most small communities I've worked in, it's been the fire chief. You know, depending, you might also have a countywide emergency manager. They're a good person to be in touch with too, because they're going to have kind of the bigger picture than your town emergency manager maybe has. You know, if you have a health department, they're good to be in touch with, because I can't tell you, I did about 3 years ago, I did a 2-year statewide program in the state of Massachusetts. And we talked in our disaster planning what you would do in the event of a pandemic. And everybody laughed at me. They're not laughing now. So, you know, again, your health department is an important link in your disaster preparedness, because you just never know what's going to happen. And then have your local Red Cross chapter included, because if you do have a big disaster, they can help. They really can. They will be there to support your staff, to support your community. So it's good to know where you can get them. So there's also a column for emergency recovery services. Right at the top is the American Institute for Conservation's National Heritage Responders. It's a big mouthful, but this is a group of people a group of conservators who are always there to help. So if you call that 202 number, it's a 24-hour hotline. And you will always get a person on the other end to help talk you off the ledge when you don't know what to do. And if they don't have an answer for you, we have a huge network of conservators who can help answer whatever question you have. And if there is a larger regional disaster, AIC or the National Heritage Responders will actually come on site. So for example, when Hurricane Sandy hit, the National Heritage Responders actually set up in a big warehouse that hadn't been impacted and was there to treat all sorts of collections from institutions around the city. So we had people at the warehouse treating materials, and then we had several teams out actually salvaging materials to bring to the warehouse. So we can be like a boots on the ground sort of group, but where our real value is in that answer to your questions. If you have conservators you have relationships with, have them down. If you have your favorite disaster recovery vendor, get their information in there. The beauty of these three is they all have their own preferred customer programs. So what they do is they send somebody out to your institution who will essentially do a risk assessment with you as well and give you their perspective. And then they're going to take down information on your parking lot and your door widths and what sort of loading dock do you have, and what's your electrical hookup? Do you have a generator or not? So what they're doing is they're gathering all this information so that if you call them, they know what they need to bring, and they will be there on site within 24 hours. If you don't have a prearranged, if you're not on their preferred customer list, they're going to send somebody out in 24 hours, but then they're going to have to walk around with you, gather all of the information, and then go back, and then maybe within another 24 hours, they'll be on site. So time is of the essence, so it really helps to be one of the preferred customers. And there is no fee for that. It is free. Always good to know where you can get a refrigerator truck in the event of an emergency, because sometimes they can't get to you. The roads are all blocked. I know in, a lot of places, if the road's blocked, nobody's getting to you. I mean, I think about Racket Lake, and if Route 28 is blocked at either end, it's, you're helicoptering in or something else. So, if you know of refrigerated trucking services, it's really great, whether it's, a rental place where you can just rent one, whether it's making friends with your local Schwann's driver who has a refrigerated truck, or your local Cisco, and be creative. There's nothing wrong with being creative in finding solutions. It's just build those relationships. Don't just put somebody's name in. Talk to them, get to know them, let them get to know you. You get better service. Data recovery services, industrial hygiene, or mold testing labs. For old buildings, this is really important. Exterminators, I've got flying squirrels. I've got a very good relationship with my exterminator because they just keep coming back. Every 3 or 4 years, they make a new hole. And if your building warrants it, a structural architect. So, again, for example, Great Camp Sagamore has an architect that they work with. That architect knows the buildings, and they'd be able to work with them in the event of a disaster. So what I've done also is I've supplied you with the regional contacts. So with Northern New York Library Network, the New York State Library, the New York State Archives, all of these will be able to help. If you need conservation services, there's Williamstown, which is in Williams, Massachusetts, just over the border. The Northeast Document Conservation Center also has a hotline that you can call, and they specialize more in library and archival materials, whereas Williamstown is very much art. So again, you know, think about contacting them if you're at a loss to find a conservator for the types of collections that you have. And then finally, I've just included the FEMA Region 2 office. This would be for really big disasters, but it's always good to just have a clue as to who to contact locally. So the backside has a lot of really great information if you are new to disasters. Oh, right, sorry. If you're not actually in Northern New York, don't contact Northern New York. Yes, good to point out, Christy. So on the backside, if you're not in Northern New York, contact your regional library council. So they're dotted all over the state. If you don't know who your regional library council is, just let me know. And I can help you figure out who your contact would be. So the backside is already set up with some stock information. So these are some of the best practices. So, you know, what do you do in an immediate response? And what do you do if it's water? And what do you know, all of this information is really there to kind of give you the checklist of what you need to do. And it's pretty much in order of what you would need to do. It gives you space to fill in your priority collection, and gives you a little bit about the incident command system, which is, we'll talk about a little bit next week, but is a much larger topic. And you can, I'll share the link for the book next week, but there's a really good book called The Incident Command System for Cultural Heritage Institutions. And it is just a compendium of excellent practical information on disaster response and recovery for libraries, archives, and museums. It is written in very plain language and is the most practical book out there that I know of for disaster recovery and response. So I will be sure that that link is in next week's webinar so that you can all take a look at it. So this is really good information, but again, some of it may not pertain to you. And this is the beauty of the Pocket Response Plan. You're getting it as a Word file, so you can do whatever it is you want with it. So if you've got your own procedures or your own information, you can adjust it and make it your own. And so, you know, if you've got already, if you already have procedures, put those in there because they're, you know, again, it is unique to you. If you've got floor plans, pop them in. You know, this is, you can pop in where your priority collections are, or like Kansas State here, you can pop in where the disaster bin locations are. And we'll talk about disaster bins next week. You know, if you have a business continuity plan, you can put information on that in here. So there's just a lot of individualizing that you can do with the pocket response plan. And that is why I absolutely adore it. So, well, there's many reasons. One, it's a single sheet. It can always be with you. And you can so easily make it your own. So a lot of people are afraid to do that, but don't be afraid. Just whatever information is important to you when it comes to disaster planning and response, get it in there. You can really make this your own. So what's here is a guide, but it's not etched in stone. So feel free to play around with it. And will you get it perfect the first time around? No. Every time you have an emergency or a disaster, pull it out. Use it, find out where the holes are, update it, improve it, and you'll always be able to, it's, again, a working document. Keep working on it, keep growing it, and, it will never be perfect, but it will always get better. So I want to open it up for any questions that anyone may have. I know I had seen one that was asking about where the link to the pocket response plan was, but I think Christy answered that already.
The only one I could really get to was the page that lists a bunch of different sort of assessments or things on that site. It wasn't a specific one you referenced.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, that's fine. No, I was talking the pocket response plan. Somebody had asked where to download the copy that I had sent to you, and you sent in an email.
Yeah, and I have it linked to the email to go out later too. So.
Okay, great.
But we didn't have any questions in the chat other than a few that I'm going to address or have already addressed. What was the third organization you mentioned for recovery?
It's the full proper name is Blackman Mormon Schematic, but catastrophe, but it goes by BMS CAT because Blackman Mormon Schematic Catastrophe is kind of a big name.
Yeah. Okay, gotcha. Cool.
I know there is one based in Rochester. I have had very mixed experiences with them.
Okay.
So I don't tend to recommend them.
Okay. I'll note that in my link that I'll share out too.
I'm not going to name names, but
yeah.
I have personally worked with Polygon and Belfour, and I have a lot of colleagues who have worked with BMS CAT. So I know that they do good work.
Does anyone have any other questions that they either want to chat or you can unmute yourself? That's all.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all for coming. Be in touch soon. Bye, everyone.